Hello, I'm Andrew Solar-Greco. We are here for another edition of our oral history project. If you could please identify yourself and
Okay,
let us know who you are.
Joel Rosenthal. I'm a distinguished professor emeritus from the Department of History at Stony Brook. I came in 1964 and I retired in 2006. And I've gotten reactive in the union because I'm now chair of the committee for retirees.
So when did you first get involved in UUP? What was your first experience at UUP?
Okay, well, actually, I antedate the creation of the UUP. When I came to Stony Brook in 64, 65, the National Organization for Faculty, and I emphasize the word faculty, was the AAUP, the American Association of University Professors. Otherwise, to my knowledge, you either joined a professional organization like the American Historical or the Modern Language, or you had no national reach in that fashion. And the AAUP had chapters at many of the SUNY campuses, and the Stony Brook chapter had been quite active defending people at St. John's University in the early 60s when they were under pressure from the administration on academic freedom matters. And the local Stony Brook chapter was very instrumental in criticizing the great drug bust of 1968, criticizing the police and the administration and raising money for legal defense, and tried to give the administration a hard time and supporting the kids, some of whom eventually went to jail, as did Mike Zweig, for what were considered no-nos by the various branches of the state of New York. The AAUP was only for faculty. It was founded in the First World War to protect faculty academic freedom and tenure rights, particularly for people who disagreed with the U.S. party line on the First World War. So when the Taylor Law was passed and we were allowed to unionize, and the vote in favor of unionization was very heavy, though there were some faculty who felt it was demeaning to have to unionize. It was beneath academic dignity, one to organize. And then, anyway, the AUP tried to be one of the representative bodies for SUNY. But when PERB, the Public Employees Relations Board, ruled that we would be one union with faculty, professionals, and librarians, you might say the AUP ship was sunk in the waters, because at that point, it would have opened membership to professionals and librarians, but they didn't feel terribly welcome, as you can imagine, since they'd been explicitly excluded until then. And we were in a bit of a vacuum. Who would represent us? The vote in favor of representation was quite strong. And in some fashion, and I wasn't too directly involved because I was still involved with the AUP, and then I became involved at the national level. I got a lot of free trips to Washington, which was very nice. But out of some cloud around the SUNY Senate emerged the body that eventually became UUP and affiliated with organized labor. So the UUP took a few years to really get its feet on the ground. One, it had no predecessor institution, you might say. It had to feel its way into its role and its strength. And the inclusion of faculty and professionals was, I think, on the state's part, either cynical, it would make it harder for us to have one voice, or it was to give the state fewer bargaining units with which to negotiate. But whatever it was, that was a very serious gulf. And in early years, faculty didn't have, other than paying membership dues, and they were okay on that, but faculty didn't feel greatly inclined to be active or to join in any aggressive way to the local UUP, and the professionals felt it could benefit them much more. And therefore, the local campus focus was much more on the very real problems of professionals, more than those of faculty. Compared to, can I go on a bit? Kind of editorialize? I've discovered in coming back to the union exec and all, that faculty are really coddled compared to professionals. And in some ways, this is true from the beginning. The difference between then and now is that now the Gulf has largely been closed, and I think faculty and professionals work together very well insofar as they have common problems from the administration. Okay?
That sounds great. I just going backwards,
Yeah.
you mentioned the great drug bust. If you could contextualize that, the moment in time that we found ourselves in back then, what it looked like, why it happened, and the kind of early campus culture.
Okay, the early campus culture was pretty good. These were the mid-60s, and it was Vietnam, and we had teach-ins against Vietnam, and we had local student demonstrations. One of the first demonstrations had to do with the collection of garbage from the dormitories and the fact that the lights on the ring road, despite the fact we had a School of Engineering and a Department of Electrical Sciences, they did the lights on the ring road. So if one light went out, the whole ring road was dark. People didn't find this very congenial, and the place was much woodsier then than it is now. So there were protests already. And then in the winter of 1968, the local establishment in the county decided that we were a hotbed not only of radicalism, which compared to Suffolk County was true, but we were a hotbed of drugs and probably also of too much casual sex. So it's sometime like 2 a.m. of some day, I think in January of 68, we had a police raid with about close to 200 county police showing up and running through the dormitories and arresting people for drugs. And they discovered, of course, that a lot of people were sleeping in the dorm room for which their parents had paid and so forth. And it was a huge to-do. And as Mike Zweig pointed out at the time, and Michael came with a lot more sophistication about university politics because he was fresher out of graduate school and he come from Michigan where the SDS had been founded. This wasn't really about drugs. It was a culture war. We represented opposition to the war. We represented support for Democratic candidates at a time when the area was very Republican. So people were hauled off. Some went to jail. Some were hauled before the State Senate Committee on Organized Crime, believe it or not. And the campus was pretty heavily in favor of the students, except the administration, which was much too quiet. Many of us were very critical. Firstly, a giant police raid was hardly necessary. We were not after armed criminals. We were simply after, they were after kids who smoked pot. And looking back, it seems, well, it's now legal. And many of us called for the legalization. I called for it at a faculty meeting in 1968-69. It didn't go very far. They should have listened to me then, but they rarely did. So anyway, this really brought politics to the campus in an aggressive way. It opened some divisions, as did the protests against Vietnam and all. But we were a politicized campus for many years. The Vietnam divisions came down to such realities as should people take research grants from the Defense Department? Should we allow recruiters from the armed forces on campus? And there, the administration said yes, because it's an open campus and free speech, but they managed to do it in a very unsympathetic way. So they alienated people who otherwise might have gone along with them. I had some other aspect, but anyway. It showed in things like the campus culture. In those days, famous popular entertainers were available for very limited amounts of money. And people like Jimi Hendrix came to campus, and just bringing Jimi Hendrix was a sign of protest and all. And supposedly, after his concert, the clouds of marijuana smoke were so thick, drifting over the Stony Brook neighborhood, that little kids playing in their backyards got high for a week. I think that's probably exaggerating and all. And people were called before the State Senate Committee, and they were asked to testify and name names. And a number of faculty and several people in the Deans of Students office were quite firm about they wouldn't name names. Maybe they'd gone to a party, maybe they'd smoked marijuana with students. It was their business. Tough luck. And few people spent short terms in jail. I trust you're going to interview Mike Zwine, who was much more involved in this and who went to jail for a while. I didn't go to jail, but when Michael was released, I drove out to Riverhead to pick him up at the gates of the county lockup and all. So it was a fairly politicized campus. Actually, it was quite a politicized campus. And this spilled over into academic areas. We had what we called a 3-day moratorium on classes, where students, faculty, administration were put into temporary committees, and they discussed the nature of the curriculum, the relevance of courses and all. A lot of this looks very old and in a sense fairly silly at the time now, but this was very vital, and we were all caught up in this. And the fact that we were a state university out in the midst of a very conservative area exacerbated all of this. Ward Melville, when he gave money for the land on which the campus was built, seemed to think, he was the local philanthropist. I think the family had holdings in a chain called Tom McGann Shoes, and I think they're big holders in CVS Pharmacy. And he was the local philanthropist, but he was quite conservative. When they rebuilt much of the Stony Brook residential area after the Second World War, they had restrictive covenants that houses couldn't be sold to Hebrews. They didn't even say Jews in those days. They were so firm in their evangelical roots. And he gave the land to the campus, and he thought he was going to get some sort of public Williams College. I think Rockefeller outsmarted him, and we got what we got. And they hired a lot of people like me and others you'll be hearing from in the old timers and all. It was not what was expected, but this exacerbated town-gown relations. Gradually, they improved. I think the passing of time, the creation of the Stoller Center, I think did a lot to improve town-gown relations, because people in the neighborhood got good entertainment, classical music, popular music at very reasonable prices without having to drive very far. But it was a strangely isolated place. Furthermore, none of the stores that are now there on 25A across from the train station were there. There was a hardware store and a sandwich shop. So in a sense, we were much more isolated. The kids had less to do. The campus was less developed. So it was a kind of, looking back, it was a lot of fun. We were building academia. I don't want to make it sound bleak and all. I mean, departments grew, enrollment grew tremendously. Student activities, level of student life improved tremendously and all. It was a rather exciting place to be. And the UUP, in a sense, had to find a niche for itself, a way to fit in. And I think gradually it did this with experience, with the turnover of personnel, and with the confrontations that came about, and it learned how to win or negotiate or accept defeat in some cases and all.
So I know that historically the formation of UUP was a merger between two organizations, right? It was SUFT and SPA, I believe, right?
Yeah,
the
I
Senate
think
Professional Association, and I think SUFT was State University. I can't remember the rest of the.
But it came out of,
yeah.
From the faculty point of side, it came out of the old SUNY Faculty Senate.
Yes. So if you could talk a little more about this early merger and what led to, what role you may or may not have played, and what led to this situation we found ourselves in with the merger of these two organizations that became United University Professionals.
Okay, in the early days, I didn't play as much of a role as looking back, I wish I had, because I was still involved, not to win the election, but I was involved with the AAUP, and I got involved with the AAUP at the national level. So as I say, I got a lot of nice trips to Washington, but I didn't have too much to do locally. I did serve a number of years late in the 20th and early in this century as the faculty grievance officer for the UUP. And I went to executive committee meetings and labor management meetings. And at that point, the few of us from the faculty who were involved were not happy about the lack of wider faculty interest in the UUP. Most faculty were members. We had reasonable success in getting to join, but we didn't have great success in getting them active or involved. We didn't have anything like the current departmental representative system, which I think is wonderful. And though I'm retired, I still pester my department's representative from time to time, and he responds, and he's beat the bushes. And the only non-member last year was one adjunct and all. So in the early days, it really took time to figure out what to do. And the administration, which you might say had to be dragged kicking and screaming into areas that now fell into labor management in a legal sense and all. Before that, grievances had been handled in an ad hoc basis. An ad hoc committee might be formed out of the faculty senate, and it was still faculty, not university senate in those days. An ad hoc committee might be formed out of the senate or out of the personnel committee, and it might meet with the appropriate administrator to deal with a personnel case or something like that. But it all, not haphazard, but you might say it was all ad hoc. Each grievance case, and I sat in on a number of them, each grievance case was a new committee, a new set of problems, and often a new administrator. And they didn't feel particularly friendly towards this anyway. So gradually, I think the UUP learned how to deal both with its own members, and this has been a long learning process because they put together these different units, and how to deal with the administration, which was not overly friendly. You can understand that. It took away some of their arbitrary powers. Well, we're having a fight over parking fees at this point, what they can do with consultation and what they can try to do without consultation remains a matter of fact. But there's no question that unionization has improved our lot. And when I go to academic conferences and I run to colleagues in my field, and I'm a medieval historian, and these colleagues teach at other state universities or in state systems, and where they're not unionized, they lament their plight and they talk about how lucky we are. So the union clearly, you might say, helped us, and it also gave a dignity to the faculty. The union of faculty and professionals and librarians gives a dignity in a sense to labor. We're workers. Faculty don't like to think of themselves in that way. And, we have 14-week summer vacations kind of thing. But nevertheless, we're workers. And it's good in the sense that we have that face. So,
absolutely. So tell us a story about a major battle, win or lose, that you had with management, whether it was during your time as grievance officer or just as a member. I'm sure there were many over the years.
Okay. One major fight that we had, and I don't think the union distinguished itself because of the complexities of this, has to do with what we call the Dubé controversy in the mid-'80s. Fred Dubé was a South African who had served prison time on Robben Island, and he was released and he got a PhD from Cornell in psychology, I think. And he was hired at Africana Studies as a regular faculty member. He was on tenure. And in the summer of 1984, he was teaching a summer school course on the politics of race. And one of the assigned topics was, is Zionism racism? And this was a straight academics topic, but some people heard about it, and it seeped into the greater New York Jewish community, and it hit the fan. This was considered, Fed was Black, and this was considered racism and beyond the bounds. By good fortune, I was the incoming president of the faculty senate in the summer, and we felt we had to look into this question, and we looked at the syllabus, and we talked to students, and of course we talked to Fred, and we reached the conclusion that this was all perfectly within the proper boundaries of an academic course and Fred's academic freedom. We made sure that no student who disagreed with him felt in any way punished. They all got the same B plus A minus that you give summer school students and all. And people who chose to ignore that topic because it was one of a list of optional topics for the term paper were not pressured by Fred to choose that topic. They could take German treatment of Nazi treatment of homosexuals or American mistreatment of Native American people or whatever they wanted. But it blew up. In fact, in a sense, the Jewish community was really after not just Fred, but the administration for not firing him, for allowing this to happen. And they got hold of a number of state legislators who put pressure on the university to take steps, as I say, to denounce him, to fire him, to shut down Africana studies, what have you. And a lot of people on the faculty had mixed feelings about it because though they understood Fred's academic freedom, they felt this was an attack upon Zionism, which easily translates into anti-Semitism, But at a very heavy vote in Fred's favor, the whole meeting of the Senate voted that he had done nothing wrong, that he was okay. But it didn't die down. It continued for a long time. Outside protest. I was once as president of the Senate, I was once in Jack Marburger's office, he being the president at the time, and he had a phone call and he said to his secretary, "I'm busy, I won't take calls." And it turned out it was the state senator. So Jack had to put me on hold and talk to some state senator, who wanted harsher measures. And there was a certain sort of reaction that was temporary. We had public lectures by a couple of named people who said silly things. We had a committee set up to investigate if this ever happened again. It never did. Had it done, it would have violated the union rights of faculty members, but it never met again because it never got worked up. And because Fred was in Africana studies or Black studies, it may have been called it. It was a very small unit. An ad hoc committee was set up to evaluate him for tenure. And he was denied tenure. And then there was a protest and he was offered a position at other SUNY campuses. The chancellor was really dodging the bullet on that. And I think he taught for a year or two upstate. And then he was getting near retirement age at that point. And I think he went back to South Africa finally. And it was a very nasty fight because it made us realize how vulnerable a public institution is to the public. I mean, we're reading about what's going on in Florida today and in other states and all. And when the political cannons are aimed at us, we're vulnerable. We have to really close the castle doors and man the barricades. I'm a medieval historian. I lapse into these metaphors easily. And pour boiling water on the state legislators who want to make trouble for us and all. So in a sense, it was a Pyrrhic victory. We defended what he had done in the classroom. We couldn't save his ass.
So the basis of his tenure denial was this, or was it?
Well, he hadn't published anything.
Okay.
And those of us who were on his side argued that his experience as a Black South African who'd been in jail, probably with Mandela, who'd been in jail and then had come to this country, become that academic, was a sufficient contribution to campus life and to student life so that he should be kept regardless. That he was probably pretty poorly paid anyway, so it wouldn't have costed him much. And I think they want to dodge the bullet. I think he was just too hot for an administration to defend. And it also made us realize the vulnerability, as I've said, about public institutions.
Yeah.
And the president, Jack Marburger, and the provost Homer Neal were pretty good, but this was just, I think, too hot for them.
Did tell us about a time that there was a coalition between students and whether it's not just UUP, but maybe just UUP or other unions on campus around any singular issue, right? You talked about parking, right? We have unity with students and the other unions on campus in opposition to this current parking plan that management's put on the table. But what are some lessons from the past that we may be able to learn from here?
Oh, okay. Going way back, when Marburger was president, it was still the days of apartheid. And ignoring the Dubé case, which touched on, it was still the days of apartheid. And both students and the union were vocal in that we didn't want SUNY to invest, as we've done recently for prison labor. We didn't want SUNY to invest in American companies that were heavily invested in South Africa. And we demonstrated, we marched around for that. And actually, Marburger was good that way. And he allowed some students to speak at the big graduation in the spring about this matter and all. So that was a sort of a general political union on campus. We marched, I'm a little fuzzy on some of the dates here, how organized UUP was. We marched against Reagan's imperial ventures, Latin America and Africa. Remember, circles around the ad building and so forth, where we denounced that. And those were pretty much, I think, union and graduate students who may not have been organized, who were just doing it as students and professionals who did that. Way back, we had we actually had a bookstore at Stony Brook in those days. That's how far back I go. And it was, I think, a Barnes and Noble, and the employees, not SUNY employees, but Barnes and Noble employees went on strike. And many of us in academia and in the student body felt we weren't going to order the books or use the bookstore until the strike was settled. It was a short strike, and academia wasn't seriously disrupted, but the administration was very upset. We had an obligation to order our books, and a Barnes and Noble internal quarrel wasn't our business, and we ignored that. We got a lot of nasty messages from the administration. We got very nasty ones about using campus mail. This was before email, even using campus mail for political events, for union events, for academic freedom meetings, and that kind of stuff. So there were ongoing disagreements on the role of the employees versus the role of management, and all. And needless to say, crises and controversies drew the groups together.
Well, how about it's my understanding, I think it was in the 70s that the campus dining workers went on strike, and that there was, some solidarity with the students there because they were dissatisfied with the campus dining options. And I mean, back when I was a student here and over the years, I know that there's long been on and off again frustration from the students with the campus dining option.
Yeah.
So do you recall this work stoppage?
Not really. That didn't affect the faculty.
Well, I mean, was there solidarity there? Was there any networking there? Was there support there?
None of it. Well, we boycotted the student cafeterias, but we did that anyway. And there were, well, the answer is I don't remember, or there wasn't. There were a lot of a board of efforts to have a sort of a faculty lunch club. Way back, it was in the old G or H dorms. Then for a while, it was on the second floor of chemistry. And they tried in the union. It never worked. Not enough faculty wanted to go across and eat lunch in a traditional, sort of waspy faculty fashion and all. But I don't think we had much to do with dorm life, where there were protests. There were strong student protests in dorms, but that seemed very far removed. There was a strong protest around the time of unionization over tripling in dorm rooms that were built for two. There was a shortage of dorm space. The university wanted to raise enrollment and to push 3 kids into what should have been a place for 2. And that led to serious protest. And I think some remediation. I think the kids got some of what they wanted. They stopped doing it. They may have used off-campus space on a very short-term basis as well, but it didn't touch faculty very directly. Those that were really undergraduate matters, and after all, even today, the unionization is the graduate students. Undergraduate matters were pretty far removed, though at times in the drug bust or the so-called 3 days where we talked about curriculum, faculty, professionals, librarians, and undergraduates were involved as well. But normally the separation there, I think, was pretty extensive. Also, there was a physical separation. I mean, I spent a couple years as the master of a dormitory in the days when they tried to have a college plan and all. And I was in what was then Roth Quad, and now Jimi Hendrix dormitory, which they insisted on renaming after he died. But my colleagues knew nothing about this kind of program. I could get someone to come and give a talk, but basically undergraduate student life and graduate and faculty lives were quite separate. And all. And that's probably a fact of life across much of the world, yeah.
So there's some founding members or of this university, of this union, or longstanding public servants like that have passed, and I'm curious if you have any fond memories or stories to share about Charlie Hansen or Hugh Cleland or Bill Gottfried or Norm Goodman.
Mixed. Okay, Charlie Hansen was a good, aggressive leader of the union, but he was not at all interested in the faculty side of things. So, in a sense, it was good news, bad news. I think my guess is that people like Judy Wishney and Mike Zweig would go along with this. He did much to raise union visibility and to get members, get people to join by actually ticking off for a payroll deduction and so forth. But he wasn't particularly, his background was in professional staff, and I don't think he was terribly interested. I'm trying to think who else. I served on the Grievance committee when John Schmidt was president. I know John socially because he worked at Old Westbury and my wife taught at Old Westbury before he came here. So we were already friends with the Schmidts, and I thought John did a pretty good job. So I had to push him to be more aggressive, but that was personality and all. Bill Godfrey was the problem with Bill is he wasn't super organized, but he was a really good guy. He had summer programs for affirmative action in the days before they got big public spending and all. He scrapped together and got local money and worked with local things like the NAACP and stuff like that, and had summer programs for minority kids. I mean, this campus was almost totally white for many, many years. When I did my history of Stony Brook, and I looked at pictures of the early graduating classes and all, if there were few people of color, they really stood out. And some years there was virtually no one of color. Bill Godfrey was good about that. And he ran for the local legislature, the state legislature. He was defeated, but he had the great slogan, put a bill in the assembly. It didn't work at all. Who else?
Hugh Cleland, Norm Goodman.
Well, Hugh was a colleague in the history department. Hugh was actually acting chair when I got hired. But I thought as the crises developed, Hugh became too sympathetic to the administration's point of view. I was probably insufficiently sympathetic to the administration's point of view. But a lot of us felt that Hugh had a really good touch with local politics and not such a great touch with academic politics. He was largely responsible for getting Steve Engelbright to run for the assembly, because I went to the memorial for Hugh and Engelbright talked about this. Engelbright was a lecturer in marine sciences or oceanography or something like that, who'd been active locally, and Hugh convinced him the area was swinging more Democratic and he should run, and he did, and all. So, I mean, Hugh was a good local politician with good links with NAACP. We hired an African-American historian who'd been teaching high schools locally, who Hugh knew through the NAACP. That was Bert Turner, for whom the Turner Fellowships are named. So we sort of fell apart on departmental matters, but I had great sort of respect for what he did in the community. He was quite aggressive that way. Norm Goodman and I came at the same time. I thought Norm was too eager to be active in too many aspects of SUNY, but he was generally a good voice and reasonably critical. I would say I was more critical, but I was happy to fade away. I was sort of more active professionally. And Norm stayed active in the statewide SUNY Senate and the local Senate, and he was chair of sociology for many years. You know, he was clearly one of the building faculty of the place and all. Yeah.
So what were some of the biggest challenges that you felt like you faced over the years, whether it was as a UUP leader or as a faculty member? You know, being here from the start, you know, you outline a lot of these things in your book.
Yeah.
But if you have some of those biggest challenges that you think it would be good for folks to hear about and reflect on and think about how they may apply to our current moment in time.
Okay. Well, let me say, until this year, when I've come back to the executive committee and I hear the professionals at greater length, I was not aware of the difficult lives of professionals compared to what I call the pampered lives of the faculty. I was talking with a friend, a retired faculty member, yesterday, not in this context. We were talking about the easy life of faculty. And I told him, I remember one time we were in England with a non-academic friend, and I said, Jesus, I only have 9 more weeks of vacation. My friend wasn't amused. She had to go to work the next day and all. So I would say a greater campus-wide awareness of what it's like to be employees of the same employer. And well, as you know, one of my minor crusades, and I'll talk to you when we're done with this recording, is to see that retired professionals get the same privileges that retired faculty get. And they're not terribly valuable, but they keep the faculty much more part of the community. Emails, invitations, discounts, things like that. Professionals lose a good deal of that when they leave. This is a campus by campus matter across SUNY. I've learned in emailing other campuses or pumping people like Judy Wishnia, who's the font of wisdom about the union and SUNY. And I hope to convince the new provost that this is unfair and all. So that's a running issue and all. And faculty mostly get left alone. And if they have trouble, they're usually handled at a department and through the personnel committee of the Senate rather than through the administration. So they're really, PERB put together disparate groups, and I think we lived fairly well together. I know of no predecessor for, well, first for unionization, but then secondly for unionization that embraced different groups of people in the way this one has. And I would say it's worked pretty well over the years, and it's had to suffer, or not suffer, but it's had to go along with a tremendous growth of campus, which poses all kinds of problems, logistical, political, economic. It's had to live through governors who disliked SUNY. Papa Cuomo disliked us. Pataki would have really closed us down to some extent, but he was too inept to be able to do this. And younger son Cuomo, younger Cuomo, didn't like SUNY either. They seem to have a feeling that they worked their way through college, and why should we carry so many people taking a significant bite out of state budget? So I think that everybody, faculty, professionals, administrators, have had to live with this. It was way back in the good old days, money ran like water, and it hasn't run like water in a long time. So the budgets have been a problem. The turnover of administrators has been a problem. We've had a reasonable turnover, not just in the presidency, but in the levels below, in the deans and the provosts, and I assume in the comparable managerial levels as well. And the fact that most of these people are outsiders looking to leave us as soon as a better offer comes from the headhunting firm doesn't help either. There's very little tradition. And tradition is good when you're talking about we used to have, we always have. I mean, the parking is a good example. They don't seem to understand that parking has been part of the contract negotiations for a long time. They could just, and I've been telling people that the solution to the parking problem is that all the students can park in the Smith Haven Mall and then walk to campus. And that will do a tremendous relief of the parking lots and all. So these are general problems of higher education that everyone deals with. And many of us in the softer fields feel that the administration, as every administration in the country, is leaning heavily towards STEM fields, and that is a disbalance in terms of our outreach to the population of New York. We still train people to teach English and history and social studies in high schools, and they have to keep aware of that.
So you mentioned this issue of significant turnover in the upper administration. Would you say that has consistently been a major issue with the same degree of severity, or has it gotten worse in more recent years?
Let's say it was always so-so. It's been greatly compounded by some terrible hirings. We've had a number of deans of the college. There have been some exceptions, but we've had a number of deans of the college who are just horrendous. Just and a provost or two who is horrendous and all. I don't know how the search committees hired them. And search committees are imperfect. I've had friends on search committees for presidents and provosts, and they hired the best candidate, and it turned out in some cases they were wrong. There isn't any protection against that. Every place suffers from that, but it's a serious disruption in the attitude. On the other end, let me give a credit where I think it's overdue. When Shirley Kenny decided that the appearance of campus had to be improved, that we were really a bloody ugly place and all, but the money for this largely came at the expense of money for faculty and professional hires and so forth. Most of us on the faculty at least thought this was a bad move. Well, looking back at the campus, literally as well as figuratively, I think she was right. The place really was an eyesore. I heard stories. We had a 1-year hiatus between the departure of John Toll, and the coming of Jack Marburger. And we had a temporary president, a man named Dick Schmidt, who would come down from upstate medical just to hold our hands for the year. This was in like 69, 70, 80, 79, 80. Anyway, and Schmidt said one of his kids had been interested in coming to Stony Brook, and they got off the train and walked across the fields to the campus. I mean, the time they got to the buildings, the kid said, I don't want to go here. So in a sense, Shirley Kenny, I think, should get an apology. I've not been in touch with Shirley Kenny to do this. I probably should try. But I think her decision, that's where money had to go, was a good one. And though she overpaid, her decisions to get the real estate in St. James, the Gyrodyne plant, and and take over the Southampton campus when Long Island University was bailing out, and renting space in Manhattan were good decisions. I think those certainly helped from the academic point of view, conferences, meetings with people, speakers, and so forth. So there's been some good news out of the administrators who came and went, but there have been some very bad news. I won't get involved in knocking personalities, but I would love to do so if we're more appropriate for this kind of event.
So you talked earlier about some of the challenges, right? Of we have a very diverse bargaining unit determined by PERB, faculty, staff, librarians, etc. how have you and other leaders worked over the years to make sure that we have unity despite our many disparate interests and many differences?
Well, let me start by asking you a question. From early on, as the med school and the health science complex grew, were they a separate unit from the very beginning? I don't really recall.
So you mean the hospital and health science center?
The East, what we now refer to as the East Campus.
So we are, what we now refer to as East Campus. We are here now on West Campus.
Right.
So to the state, we are, Stony Brook is a single employer. So
Okay,
we all work for Stony Brook as a single employer.
But we're separate
Separate UUP chapters. There's the one local which is statewide, but in UUP's world, we are two separate UUP chapters: East Campus, West Campus, Stony Brook HSC, and Stony Brook Center Campus.
Okay. In the days when the health science world was smaller, I think they had more problems, and how we would coordinate with them. Well, it seems to become an issue as we were separate chapters, and each chapter grew in strength and in experience and all. But in a sense, could they have made that one chapter? I mean, you're active recently. Do you think it would have been advantageous, or do you think our interests are too divergent to be in one chapter with the health science people?
Well, I think there's a lot of complications, right? For one, between both sides of the street, I mean, you're looking at nearly roughly 8,000 people. That's just too large of a group to manage with one structure. But also things are different, right? There's a third shift over there. You have to take into account patient confidentiality and HIPAA and all these healthcare related concerns. Academic freedom and academics issues apply for those who are teaching in the health science center. But then, of course, there's the whole Stony Brook medicine and the healthcare apparatus and all the unique things that come into play there. So I think, as a matter of sheer size, that is a major complication, and managing that whole enterprise as a single chapter, I imagine, would be very difficult.
Oh, so the division there at least is a reasonable.
My question is more specifically on the lines of some of the things you talked about, right? Of faculty and staff not necessarily being on the same page, and working to build the unity between not just faculty and staff, but the varieties of the various hierarchies we have on our campus, for example, or in academia in general. So, for example, we have adjuncts and lecturers, and they're under the same union and umbrella as the tenured and tenured faculty. And we have athletics coaches and athletics folks. We also have folks who sit behind the desk and do conventional white collar work. All of these very different interests that are all under the same union umbrella. So managing that, I'm interested in hearing about keeping that body unified through contract negotiations, through the tumult of campus politics and just Suffolk County politics and the whole state politics, the whole situation over many years.
Okay, there I would say the union's been fairly successful, slowly but steadily. I think it's worked to merge interests and all. Also, just a historical comment: the librarians were put in with the professionals and the faculty. That was done at a time when the library was much bigger and given a bigger budget and had many more personnel. So they were a significant part of the union, of the campus employment profile. The library has shrunk in both budget and size and personnel. And now I think the librarians are more or less merged in with faculty interests, but not a significant body. There are just not enough of them left and all, that they really chiseled down the university and all. This is, let's say, one of the less glorious aspects of the growth of Stony Brook. It partially reflects local interest. It partially affects where you can cut budgets. You can buy fewer books. You can't get rid of faculty easily. The interest between full-time tenure track faculty and the increasing number of lecturers and adjuncts is a serious area of controversy and all. And I think this is handled differently in different departments, but this is a universal growth across academia, fewer tenure track people. I would say, to its credit, the administration has almost never turned down a tenure-track faculty member whose credentials pass the muster of the faculty committee. But it's made up for the need to keep people for life. And let's say my salary wasn't draining the state budget very seriously, but it's kept up with the need to have fewer people for life by the willingness to allow them to hire more adjuncts and lecturers. And let me say furthermore, and this is a reflection on what we call the managerial takeover of universities, of corporations. I was chair of my department a number of times, going back to the mid-'80s. And when I was chair the first time, I had a good deal more discretion. And it's not because I was such a powerful political figure. I had a considerably more discretion over the use of the budget, the hiring of adjuncts and lecturers, the fact giving of faculty schedules, letting people do extra work in return for time off. I had much more discretion than subsequent chairs in any, at least in any of the humanities departments that I know has anymore. So there's been a constant sort of administrative looking over the shoulder. That's the case now. I know the history department has had a recent series of crises or controversies over interference and involvement in telling the department what to do. And I suspect this is true across much of the board and all. So, I mean, that's a whole change in the tenor of higher education. Way back, this is sort of an anecdote, but I think it's revealing. When we first really got organized in the 60s, and John Toll was brought in as president in 65, 66, or whenever, he would chair meetings of the faculty senate. And it wasn't until we realized that much of the business of the Senate was a no confidence motion in John Toll, that the executive committee of the Senate convinced him that though he was a welcome member, he was a professor of physics, but he shouldn't chair the meeting where he had a, how many are in favor of censuring me? 103, 104, 105 kind of thing. But in a sense, the faculty administration were much closer. And many of the upper level administrators came from the faculty as well. You know, they were insiders already. And I think we've suffered over the years from the moving away from that pattern.
Moving away from promotion from within.
From within. And then, right, people who, when their career, when their term as an administrator was over, went back to their faculty department, not moved on elsewhere.
Now it's more of a formality. They'll hire a dean or a provost. They're technically within a department, but they have no obligation at the department, and then they leave for another university.
Right.
We've certainly seen that.
Yes, yeah, and you see it probably more so at the professional level, because
well, that too.
Yeah, I mean, they can't. We had a recent provost who I gather was good in this field, and when his short term as provost was up, went back to his academic department and is now, I think, a regular member of the department. You don't do that for professionals.
No.
If you're running it and you're out, you go.
Yeah.
Back.
So what has your kind of experience or relationship been like over the years, or the chapters for that matter, with the statewide organization? Right, we are one of the 32 UUP chapters, and we are part of a statewide local.
Yeah, I've had less involvement with that. Some was just a disinclination to run up to Albany, kind of thing. I spent 1 year as a SUNY senator. And that was sort of interesting. I thought the SUNY Senate was just a lot of gas. But the chancellor came and addressed us, and it was interesting to see. And I saw a couple of the upstate campuses. Brockport's built on the Erie Canal, which was sort of fun to learn. I didn't know that sort of thing. I've not done very much with the union as a union as a delegate, though I think I was technically a delegate, and I went to a couple of meetings and all. So I don't know too much about that. I got the feeling that the Stony Brook representatives tended to be more radical or on the left of the general statewide thing. that may reflect the difference between the culture of a university and the culture of the campuses in small towns. Yeah. One of my kids taught at SUNY Oneonta for a few years, and we visited them, and I saw the campus, of course. But I got the impression it was much more, it was a college town in a traditional Hollywood movie sense, and the interests were more locally focused, which was very reasonable for the colleges where they were often the main employers. If the town wasn't lucky enough to have a prison built, and the GE or GM plant was closing down, the college was very critical, and therefore local rapport, local political harmony was more important. Whereas to us, not so much. We don't depend on the Stony Brook community. If anything, it's much more the other way. And over the years, for various reasons, I think fewer of the Stony Brook faculty live in the immediate area. It's certainly true in fields I know about. Scientists have to be in a great deal more than people in softer fields, so they may find it still convenient to live close by. But I mean, many of the new hires, say in history and English and sociology areas where I know people, are people who commute somewhere west of Huntington and all. So there's less feeling towards the local community. Many have no feeling. And if they come on the train, they have that same walk across the field that Dick Schmidt's kids had, only it looks a lot nicer now. But I mean, they don't have any reason to hang around in Port Jeff forever. I know where you live. You're a local, but fewer of my younger colleagues are.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's.
I like a short commute.
Yeah, I do too. Yeah. In fact, one of the boons I got, apart from having a nice job at a growing place, was we found a good house in Port Jefferson. Yeah. That's very close, and there used to be parking available.
Yeah, it used to be.
Parking has been an issue since I came.
Yeah.
Somebody, an administrator who'd been here even longer than I have, told me that the master plan for Stony Brook for the students would be half dorm and half daily commuters. So parking was going to be written in as a daily problem when the undergraduate enrollment was 2,400 or 17,000.
Well, that's fascinating because now there's significantly more commuters than residential.
As they've outgrown the dorms. Yeah. So it's always been a problem.
So has there been collaboration, to the best of your knowledge, between UUP and the undergraduate student government or the graduate student organization, or instances where there was collaboration around an issue with our colleagues across the street at the HSC Hospital UUP chapter?
One of the things I wanted to quiz you about today, because I have a number of other questions that are just between you and me, is I think maybe you and the two vice presidents should meet with your counterparts on the Graduate Student Union and the Civil Service Union and people from these campus at least once a semester. I think that's something. So in a sense, I'm throwing the ball right back to you because I don't know much about it, but I have these plans for what other people should have to do.
No, I'm curious about if there's been unity around issues in the past or whatnot, but at this moment in time, we certainly do meet more often than not.
Good.
More often than that frequency around issues, and right now specifically around parking.
We have, I think. Well, I only know at this point from actually marching on campus. We marched just before COVID about. It was a financial matter that hit graduate students.
Or the fees, their fees.
Yes. Yeah, and there, of course, the union endorsed it and asked many of us to come and march with them. No, I've spent a limited amount of time walking in circles around campus over the years, going back to Vietnam and DOD and drugs and Reagan in South America and in Libya. I remember making a speech about he was sending troops to places I remember as a kid that we fought in World War II and then more recently. And I think, let me ask you, in softer fields, the organization of the graduate students has been politically a good thing, but I don't think it's affected daily life very much. But I get the impression in the sciences where people compete for summer grants and research teams and all, it's made a bigger difference.
When you say the organization, you mean the
GSEU,
Graduate Student
yeah.
Employees Union. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's made a big difference in many ways, right? I mean, there was a few departments that were facing closure about 10 years ago, maybe less than 10 years ago. And you know, GSU fought to save them, and those were quote unquote soft departments,
Okay.
as you put them. So
Okay, I
think
knew
it's
about
been-
such stuff from the
yeah.
faculty point of view.
Yeah.
I know times when various departments were on the brink of receivership.
Yeah, well, and that's actually one of the questions I was going to for you is to, you know, talk about, you know, your recollection of what it was like for the graduate students before they organized, and their early organization in the 90s, what role UUP may have played, UUP Stony Brook may have played in supporting those early unionization efforts in the early 90s by the graduate students that ended up forming the graduate student employees.
Okay, well,
that represented the TAs and GS.
Yeah. The history department wasn't terribly involved at that point. We actually had a short strike of graduate students in the 80s, a 1 or 2 day refusal to teach their classes. And my colleagues were quite split on that. Some people said no, they were going to show up and teach, and others of us said in solidarity we wouldn't go to class. You know, that was an internal matter. I think it had to do with how we handed out. We in the early days of graduate studies, there were not only a huge number of TA ships, but they paid very well, relatively. And over the years, there were fewer TA ships and they paid less. And many departments, and mine included, got in the practice of giving fractions of a TA ship. You got a half TA ship kind of thing. And at some point, the idea grew up, we should have a means test. We should decide, because many people, you know, were part of a partnership, had other money and all, and could have continued in graduate school with a half or no TA ship. And when it was suggested that we look into this for the history department, the graduate students struck. They said that we object to this. We get the TA ships because of our promise as future historians. And if I'm married to someone who makes a significant income or what have you, that's not relevant to why I was admitted to the history graduate program. And they struck for a couple of days. And many of us honored that and didn't go to class. And again, the department got one of these sharp admonitions from administration, like with the bookstore strike. They're very reactionary in labor matters. It turns out now that we reminisce about it, they were always against labor. Well, that's management, I guess. I was never in management above the level of department chair, and that department that has almost no external funding. That's not management at all. So we got admonished by the administration, and so on and so forth. But we supported the graduate students, and I guess but their unionization didn't affect soft departments nearly as much. I mean, we had few adjuncts in those days and a handful of lecturers who we tried to make as much part of the regular faculty as we could. We had somebody who recently retired as a lecturer, and we had a deal for some years. If she could publish a bit, we could get her onto a tenure track line, but she never did for various personal and family reasons and all. So I will say that I didn't have much role in the unionization of the graduate students. I mean, we supported it, but it didn't touch us very much. We treated people well. Judy Wisher was my TA.
Oh, yeah.
I had asked Judy how I treated her. Well, actually, my department had an early rule that you split the grading fractionally. If you had one TA, you did half the grading, and the TA did half. If in the big lecture courses you had three or four TAs, you still did 25 or 20%. We had this rule, and occasionally a colleague would grumble about it, and we said, "Tough luck. That's the way we work."
That's very
so we were, yeah.
I mean, I think there's been, I've heard issues of some faculty who don't help at all with grading, who they go to a conference or they travel for personal, speaking tours or whatever, and they leave the course completely to the
No, we were very,
TAs.
no, we were very hard on that. And also just a lot, and when we graded, let's say Judy was my TA and we did 50-50, and then I did her 50% for the next grading, so we wouldn't have student favorites or students we were out to get, so we tried to turn it over as well.
So just a couple more questions. So were you involved at all in the fight to bring a childcare center to our campus?
No. Some of that was personal. I didn't like the people who were doing the fighting. And some of it, my kid was already in a private, in one of these unofficial daycare centers in Stony Brook, and we weren't going to move. And also, to be honest, I didn't want my family deeply involved in campus. That was, I didn't like John Tolan, and I thought there was enough. I was involved. My wife became a graduate student in sociology when they opened the graduate student program. I didn't really want my kids to come to campus. Much later, one of my kids took courses, so forth. But that was many years later. But I had a 3 or 4-year-old at the time. No, I was never involved either way.
Is there more you wish to say about Toll in the early years and why you may feel that way?
Well, looking back, Toll was a terrible man who built this place. He had narrow vision, and he had no sympathy for anything that deviated from this narrow. I think of him as a tractor that was put on high throttle, and it just went ahead. And many of us felt at the beginning of a university, a public institution, we could have a much greater voice for students, for faculty, for the community. And he wasn't interested. In fact, when I wrote my history of Stony Brook and I read his annual report to the chancellor, his annual report to the chancellor showed a sympathy for students going to college during Vietnam. Oh, and we had local open housing marches too. We had integration housing, whatever you call it, for the community, which was quite racist. You won't believe that, of course, but it was. And I discovered he was much more sympathetic to this when he was summarizing the year to the chancellor than he ever appeared to be in talking to the kids. And he had less sympathy with the drug bust than he did when he was quoted in Newsday or the Suffolk Sun, as it was then, what have you, and all. So he was a very strange, in fact, I learned recently, what was I reading, that when he was interviewed for here, it was to be either chair of physics or dean of physical sciences. And he went home and wrote such a long memo about the future of the university that they offered him the presidency instead of a middle-level administrative job. So I thought he was narrow-minded at a time when I thought that he could have been more open about the other aspects. On the other hand, he probably would have said, if I don't focus on a few fields, we won't get nearly as much. He would, I mean, my own metaphor is he would go to Albany and he would get in the window to get, say, an extension to the library. And they would say, well, we closed that window, but you can get a new wing of the engineering building. So he would jump over to the next window, take what you can get and all. And and let's say he got a lot of flack from the faculty, and I don't know if it softened him. I mean, I wasn't close enough to the inside circles and all. Actually, Norm Goodman stayed much closer. Norm no longer is interviewable, of course, he died last year. But he stayed much closer, and he occasionally would tell me stories. And on the one hand, I thought he exaggerated his role and his influence. And on the other hand, I thought it was good that a senior faculty member was at that meeting. So
tell us a little more about this book that you wrote. What led you to want to write it?
Okay,
how people might be able to find it now.
Now it's 20 years old. We just moved into a smaller place, so I dumped about 200 copies on the alumni office with instructions that they're to get rid of them any way they want, probably including the landfill. I had a couple conservative colleagues in the in my department, the conservative meaning pro-administration, and talked to them about doing a history of the university. And I had visions of some sort of official top-down history of the university. Now, it turned out my colleagues never wrote the thing. One of them left, and the other never published anything anyway. But that got me thinking about it. And then a kind of other than top-down history of the university. And I was going to write it with my friend and colleague, Ted Goldfarb, who was a chemist, who was very much on the left on campus matters. But Ted unfortunately died a long time ago. There's a plaque as you go from the Fine Arts Center or the academic side of Stoller Center into the Fine Arts auditoriums. There's a plaque to Ted talking about what a good stickball player he was. There's a lot of different things, and I wouldn't think of stickball. Anyway, Ted and I were going to write, and Ted got sick and he suffered through leukemia and died. But by then, I'd written a lot of history. I mean, I could write history quite easily, to be honest. And I decided I would try to do a history of the place that wasn't top down, and it would talk about all aspects: student life, faculty life, how departments hired and grew, our relations with the community, and it was fun. And I used the Statesman and the yearbook, and a little bit of departmental stuff. I did no oral interviews, and I had people ask me questions about that. I said, I'd been here almost as long as anyone else. I've had my points of view. I don't have to talk to my friends that will agree with me, and I don't have to talk to people who will disagree with me because they're not change anything I'm going to say anyway. I remember a man, Peter Kahn, who was in the physics department, and we got along personally, but he was very strongly pro John Toll, as the chair of physics would be. And Peter wanted me to interview, and Homer Neal, who was a physicist and the provost, worried that I would only portray one point of view. That's probably true. And someone who disagrees with me can go write his own history. And actually, Peter Kahn wrote a history of the physics department, which is quite good. It's an article, not a full-length book, but it interested me. And I like to write history, and I'm still doing it.
So if folks want a copy, they should go to the alumni.
The alumni,
Okay.
we moved into a smaller place. I have about 3 copies left. And we had 3. Well, I self-published it. And when you use a print shop, a local up on Wisconsin Highway or somewhere, the difference between printing 500 and printing 1,000 copies is very small in terms of price.
Yeah.
So once I was paying to have it done, I had print more. And of course, I look back on my career as a teacher, and I grossly overestimated student interest in buying and reading the history of their own college. I thought it'd be a student hot seller. It wasn't. So I had a lot of copies, and I originally sold them. And the problem with selling them is I actually went out to Riverhead and registered as a business. Is I then had to turn in my tax statement every quarter, or 6 months, whatever it was, on my profits. And I was always late in turning it in, and my penalty for late was almost exactly the same as my royalty for selling it. So I officially went out of business, and I took to giving them away. And I see them 1 or 2 on the Union shelf here, and I haven't met them. It was fun to do. Oh, and then I discovered, and I won't, that writing college histories is a huge industry. There are hundreds of them, and I actually wound up doing some scholarship and publishing some scholarly articles on the writing of college histories in this country and all. And I got interested in my own book, but then that led me to a number of articles about other campuses and all. Not on their history as such, but on the historiography, the writing of their histories. I mean, in 1936, Harvard was 300 years old, and they had a huge project of volume after volume on their history, this kind of thing.
Well, and it's so interesting to examine, for myself, having read your book, I enjoyed it because I walked in both worlds. I work here now I'm a labor leader here now, but I'm also an alum as a student.
You're-
So I had many different experiences and
When
you know,
did you graduate?
2011.
Okay.
Yeah. So so it's so interesting because with universities and colleges, right, it's such a personal experience as a student. You even if you don't live here, you feel like you lived here as a commuter because you're here so many hours and you learn and develop and grow so much. And then as a worker, universities typically hold on to workers for a longer amount of time than some other workplaces, especially these days. So there's so much interest in that. So it is quite a contribution. But speaking of a person whose impact has persisted here and a longstanding issue, I was curious if you personally knew Ashley Schiff.
Yeah. Oh,
And if
yeah.
you can
That's
tell
what
us a story about
I knew
Ashley and
Ashley.
the fight
Ashley
for the preserve.
came either when I did or a year before. And Ashley was, in a sense, and I mean this as a compliment, a crank. At a time when most political scientists were interested in voting behavior or bicameral legislation, Ashley decided the public interest should be focused on the environment. He was the first person I think that I knew that got interested in this and published some early and quite influential stuff on the environment. And then he died very young. In fact, that's strange. Ashley was a twin, and we went to where the family was sitting Shiva, and there was somebody who looked just like Ashley.
Wow.
It was really creepy. But Ashley was a good voice on that. And he helped early on tilt faculty interest and administration support for his interest towards the environment. And well, the fact that we preserved the Ashley Schiff wood and a certain amount of woodland elsewhere and all, and has made us a little more environmentally concerned. When they built the south parking lot, the huge student parking lot, the people in nearby houses raised questions or complaints, and we assured them, and this was back to John Toll, that there'd be some green barrier. Now, it may only be one forsythia bush, but there'd be some green barrier between the university road and the houses behind there. So Ashley was a good conscience raiser in that way, and he was a crank for it. He went around drumming it, and he would come to meetings and want to talk about that when no one else cared yet or knew anything about it.
So when was South P built? That was back when Toll was president? Because that's
maybe probably at least the plans for it.
And was that wooded or was that an empty, like a previously bulldozed space?
Who knew? You never went that way. I've been living in Port Jefferson.
There you go. You came
I even went to the Wisconsin Highway to 25A.
There you go.
I'm trying to think. I was a state senator in the late 70s, early 80s, and I returned my state car. They gave us a state car to go upstate. And I remember just to test it, I parked there and walked. It took me almost 45 minutes to walk from South P lot to where the history department was. So, but it was there, or they were building it. They realized the need. And I mean, parking garages are wonderful, but they're expensive to build. And I don't know if students would want to buy them anyway.
Yeah.
So
you talked earlier about Africana studies. There's also what was in its formation, women's studies, now called women, gender, sexuality studies. These are two departments that at other campuses as well as here were formed in the struggle of social change. Okay. They were not necessarily something the administration wanted.
I was involved in the creation of women's studies. Mm-hmm. Africana studies as a supporter and friend, but not actively in any way. The way women's studies was founded is that in 1975, 76, they retrenched the education department. And between the local administrative interpretation and the contract, if people from education could put forth a case to be rehired by a different department and do something different, as we couldn't sneak K through 12 or K through 6 education into another department. But if people could do something different and the department wanted them, they could be hired. 2 or 3 women who'd been in the ed department were getting interested in women's studies. And the dean then or shortly after was a woman who was sympathetic, an economist named Estelle James. I was chair of something called an interdisciplinary social science program. And because I knew the women and I was politically sympathetic, I tried to fight against the retrenchment. Another battle I didn't win. I invited them into social science interdisciplinary on the idea that they would focus on women's studies, and eventually, with support and growth, they move out and became an independent thing. A woman named Beverly Burns, who worked on neonatal development problems, and Barbara Baskin, and I don't remember what Barbara worked on, and all, were the two women whom I was allowed to pick up. I mean, the administration allowed this, so I was a good guy, but I had support, you know.
So they joined the history department?
No, they joined the social studies interdisciplinary.
Okay.
That got founded because psychology had so many majors, it couldn't cope with them. And they convinced the administration that we should have a general social science major as well. And I wound up partially because of friends who were involved in the administration, and partially because I'd gone to Chicago where they went in for this. I chaired that. And when these women got dumped, they allowed me to pick them up in social science, and they quickly developed their own program and gradually moved away. Someone who was of Chinese origins went into what became Chinese and Asian studies. A couple people went into English because they were still doing secondary school teacher training, and these were people who could do that, and so forth. So a number of people got picked up. A number of people were left in the cold by the retrenchment. It was really brutal. And I didn't have any role, but as a spectator, they tried to fight it in the courts, and I went to Riverhead as a supportive, sympathetic audience. And the judge in Riverhead said to the people from education, "You've been screwed, and your contract allows them to screw you." So, but anyway, women's studies came out of that, and gradually they moved into their own, and they were much more historically oriented. And then they were given their own line a couple years later, and Judy Wisnia she had just finished her PhD, and Judy was the person to hire in that. It was heavily historical, and I worked on women's history a good deal anyway, so I was.
And how about African studies? What led to the creation of that department? Just the Black Power and 60s.
Yeah, I'm thinking the first hire I can think of was a guy named Les Owens. And he was affiliate, his field was history. He'd done a well-regarded book on slavery. So he had an affiliate with history, but he was hired as an independent unit. I'm trying to think if there was a predecessor movement and all. And then he was allowed to hire other people. Bill McAdoo eventually it grew up and it hired more people and diversified.
I know what Amiri Baraka chaired at one point.
He came later. Yeah. Because I was actually on the committee. Can you imagine they hired him as an associate professor, and I was on the committee that recommended he be promoted to full. I mean, here's this. I mean, we've had various distinguished people and writers on the faculty, but Baraka is the towering figure. If you did the history of American literature in the 20th century, he gets half a chapter at least, and all. And they didn't even make him a professor. We got friendly over the Dubé case because, needless to say, his unit was being attacked, and he discovered. He asked me, he said, though, well, but he was a good figure. He was already, you might say, leaning towards retirement, and he was commuting from Newark.
No.
And he was getting older. And he had a kid driving from Newark. I mean, but nevertheless, but he was chair, but he wasn't the founding chair. I mean, and he was looking for a job. He told me he got a lot of invitations to speak at black colleges for about $200 a talk.
Wow.
So a paycheck every other Wednesday was not unwelcome. You know, I think McAdoo. McAdoo was hired in the early '80s, I get, not McAdoo, or Les Owens.
Yes.
So that's, I think, beginning.
Okay.
And there I'm fuzzy.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
fine. So my final kind of question, right, is, you know, I started this project because UUP's been around for 50 years, and I want to memorialize the founding stories and sit down with as many of the founding members and the early founding members. And I've asked all of you many of these same questions, but I want to close with the same question: is what gives you hope for the next 50 years of UUP and of public higher education?
Well, unionization has worked. Whatever the problems of higher education, they've been lessened or softened by unionization. And now looking back, I like the idea of bringing, well, and some of this is just my recent experience on the exec committee. I like the idea of bringing faculty and staff and librarians together. I say, because I was always representing faculty as faculty grievance officer and so forth, I had less to do with the professional side of it, and the professionals had less to do with us. So I think that looking back, whether PERB meant it to be friendly or not or harmful, I think that was a good idea. Higher ed, I worry about, partially budget and partially, I mean, Ron DeSantis, my wife is tired of my announcing as we watch MSNBC what Biden should do. Biden should announce that what DeSantis is trying to do in Florida is Hitler. He's trying to control books people can read and what people can talk about. It's really beyond, it's way beyond Trump. It's Nazism. And I worry that in all the states that are eager to forbid abortions, they will take a cue from him and start looking into college curriculum and hiring of faculty and post-tenure review. You know how it's a frightening thing at all. Tenure means you don't have post-tenure reviews. So in a sense, I worry a bit about public higher education. Yeah.
Well, what gives you hope? Just that unions are bringing people together, or
they are? Yes. I hope that ultimately people will realize the republic was built on a more casual approach to things. We didn't look into what teachers taught in classroom and what books kids read, you know. And as people have said, I don't know anyone who's corrupted.
Yeah.
I don't know. So, yeah.
So do you have any last thoughts or things you wish to share with our audience today?
No, it's keep up the good fight. It'll never end.
Yeah.
And we have internal enemies and external enemies. And a lot of people who just don't give a damn. It isn't as bad as being an enemy, but it's not so good. It's a fight that has to go. And higher ed is a great project. And the fact that we still educate a large portion of the population at what's still a relatively low cost are things in the sense that does make me, not many things make you cheerful about being American these days, but that's on the short list.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for your time
It's a
today.
pleasure. Then let me talk to you about a couple of things.